Hello there. Hello, Terry, Sean, Liddy Beth. Oh, suddenly I can't remember the other names. There were lots of names that showed up initially. Welcome, everyone. I'm Gildart. This is Fireside Reading. Every day at 5, almost every day at 5, I sit in front of the fire and read a chapter of a wonderful old book. And currently we're reading a passage to India, and I left us hanging a little bit when we got to the trial. I didn't read yesterday, but I am going to read today, and on until we go to Italy for Christmas. So I think that's the middle of next week that we're leaving, so we'll be reading until then, unless something else happens, in which case I'll let you know. I don't think we'll get to the end of the book before Christmas, however, so we'll have to finish it at the start of the new year. And it'll leave us something exciting to look forward to next year. Currently, however, we got to the part in chapter 24 where the trial is just about to start. Welcome to a fireside reading of A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, Chapter 24, Part 2. Presently, the case was called. Their chairs preceded them into the court, for it was important that they should look dignified, and when the Chuprasis had made all ready, they filed into the ramshackly room with a condescending air, as if it was a booth at a fair. The collector made a small official joke as he sat down, at which his entourage smiled, and the Indians, who could not hear what he said, felt that some new cruelty was afoot. Otherwise the Sarbs would not chuckle. The court was crowded, and of course very hot, and the first person Adela noticed in it was the humblest of all who were present, a person who had no bearing officially upon the trial, the man who pulled the punkah. Almost naked and splendidly formed, he sat on a raised platform near the back in the middle of the central gangway, and he caught her attention as she came in, and he seemed to control the proceedings. He had the strength and beauty that sometimes comes to flower in Indians of low birth, when that strange race nears the dust and is condemned as untouchable. Then nature remembers the physical perfection that she accomplished elsewhere and throws out a god, not many, but one here and there, to prove to society how little its categories impress her. This man would have been notable anywhere. Among the thin-hammed, flat-chested mediocrities of Chandrapur, he stood out as divine. Yet he was of the city. Its garbage had nourished him. He would end on its rubbish heaps. Pulling the rope towards him, relaxing it rhythmically, sending swirls of air over others, receiving none himself, he seemed apart from human destinies, a male fate, a winnower of souls. Opposite him, also on a platform, sat the little assistant magistrate, cultivated, self-conscious, and conscientious. The punkah-wallah was none of these things. He scarcely knew that he existed, and did not understand why the court was fuller than usual. Indeed, he did not know that it was fuller than usual. Didn't even know he worked a fan, though he thought he pulled a rope. Something in his aloofness impressed the girl from middle-class England, and rebuked the narrowness of her sufferings. In virtue of what had she collected this roomful of people together? her particular brand of opinions, and the suburban Jehovah who sanctified them, by what right did they claim so much importance in the world and assume the title of civilization? Mrs. Moore. She looked around, but Mrs. Moore was far away on the sea. It was the kind of question they might have discussed on the voyage out before the old lady had turned disagreeable and queer. While thinking of Mrs. Moore, she heard sounds which gradually grew more distinct. The epoch-making trial had started, and the superintendent of police was opening the case for the prosecution. Mr. McBride was not at pains to be an interesting speaker. He left eloquence to the defense, who would require it. His attitude was, "Everyone knows the man's guilty, and I'm obliged to say so in public before he goes to the Andamans." He made no moral or emotional appeal, and it was only by degrees that the studied negligence of his manner made itself felt, and lashed part of the audience to fury. Laboriously did he describe the genesis of the picnic. The prisoner had met Miss Quested at an entertainment given by the principal of Government College, and had there conceived his intentions concerning her. The prisoner was a man of loose life, as documents found upon him at his arrest would testify. Also, his fellow assistant, Dr. Panalal, was in a position to throw light on his character, and Major Calendar himself would speak. Here Mr. McBride paused. He wanted to keep the proceedings as clean as possible, but Oriental pathology, his favorite theme, lay around him, and he could not resist it. Taking off his spectacles, as was his habit before enunciating a general truth, he looked into them sadly and remarked that the darker races are physically attracted by the fairer, but not vice versa. Not a matter for bitterness, this, not a matter for abuse, but just a fact which any scientific observer will confirm. "Even when the lady is so uglier than the gentleman?" The comment fell from nowhere, from the ceiling, perhaps. It was the first interruption, and the magistrate felt bound to censure it. "Turn that man out," he said. One of the native policemen took hold of a man who had said nothing and turned him out roughly. Mr. McBride resumed his spectacles and proceeded, but the comment had upset Miss Quested. Her body resented being called ugly and trembled. "Do you feel faint, Adela?" asked Miss Derrick, who tended her with loving indignation. "I never feel anything else, Nancy. I shall get through, but it's awful. Awful." This led to the first of a series of scenes. Her friends began to fuss around her, and the Major called out, "I must have better arrangements than this made for my patient. Why isn't she given a seat on the platform? She gets no air." Mr. Das looked annoyed and said, "I shall be happy to accommodate Miss Quested with a chair up here in view of the particular circumstances of her health." The Chuprasis passed up not one chair, but several, and the entire party followed Adela onto the platform, Mr. Fielding being the only European who remained in the body of the hall. "That's better," remarked Mrs. Turton as she settled herself. "Thoroughly desirable change, for several reasons," replied the Major. The magistrate knew that he ought to censure this remark, but did not dare to. Calendar saw that he was afraid and called out authoritatively, "Right, McBride, go ahead now. Sorry to have interrupted you." "Are you all right yourselves?" asked the... "Are you all right yourselves?" asked the superintendent. "We shall do, we shall do." "Go on, Mr. Darcy, we are not here to disturb you," said the collector patronizingly. Indeed, they had not so much disturbed the trial as taken charge of it. While the prosecution continued, Miss Quested examined the hall, timidly at first, as though it would scorch her eyes. She observed to left and right of the punkah man many a half... She observed to left and right of the punkah man many a half-known face. Beneath her were gathered all the wreckage of her silly attempt to see India, the people she had met at the bridge party, the man and his wife who hadn't sent their carriage, the old man who would lend his car, various servants, villagers, officials, and the prisoner himself. There he sat, strong, neat little Indian, with very black hair and pliant hands. She viewed him without special emotion. Since they last met, she had elevated him into a principle of evil. But now he seemed to be what he'd always been, a slight acquaintance. He was negligible, devoid of significance, dry like a bone, and though he was guilty, no atmosphere of sin surrounded him. I suppose he is guilty. Can I possibly have made a mistake? She thought. For this question still occurred to her intellect, though since Mrs. Moore's departure it had ceased to trouble her conscience. Pleader Mahmud Ali now arose and asked with ponderous and ill-judged irony whether his client could be accommodated on the platform too. Even Indians felt unwell sometimes, though naturally Major Calendar did not think so, being in charge of a government hospital. "Another example of their exquisite sense of humour," sang Miss Derrick. Ronnie looked at Mr. Darcy to see how he would handle the difficulty, and Mr. Darcy became agitated and snubbed Pleader Mahmud Ali severely. "Excuse me." It was the turn of the eminent barrister from Calcutta. He was a fine-looking man, large and bony, with grey, closely cropped hair. "We object to the presence of so many European ladies and gentlemen upon the platform," he said in an Oxford voice. "They will have the effect of intimidating our witnesses. Their place is with the rest of the public in the body of the hall. We have no objection to Miss Quested remaining on the platform, since she has been unwell. We shall extend every courtesy to her throughout, despite the scientific truths revealed to us by the District Superintendent of Police. But we do object to the others." "Oh, cut the cackle and let's have the verdict," the Major growled. The distinguished visitor gazed at the magistrate respectfully. "I agree to that," said Mr. Darcy, hiding his face desperately in some papers. "It was only to Miss Quested that I gave permission to sit up here. Her friends should be so excessively kind as to climb down." "Well done, Darcy, quite sound," said Ronnie with devastating honesty. "Climb down, indeed! What incredible impertinence!" Mrs. Turton cried. "Do come quietly, Mary," murmured her husband. "Hi! My patient can't be left unattended." "Do you object to the civil surgeon remaining, Mr. Amritrao?" "I should object. A platform confers authority." "Even when it's 1 foot high? So come along all," said the collector, trying to laugh. "Thank you very much, sir," said Mr. Darcy, greatly relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Hislop. Thank you, ladies all." And the party, including Miss Quested, descended from its rash eminence. The news of their humiliation spread quickly, and people jeered outside. Their special chairs followed them. Mahmud Ali, who was quite silly and useless with hatred, objected even to these. By whose authority had special chairs been introduced? Why had the Nawab Bahadur not been given one, etc.? People began to talk all over the room about chairs, ordinary and special, strips of carpet, platforms 1 foot high. But the little excursion had a good effect on Miss Quested's nerves. She felt easier now that she had seen all the people who were in the room. It was like knowing the worst. She was sure now that she should come through all right. That is to say, without spiritual disgrace. And she passed the good news on to Ronnie and Mrs. Turton. They were too much agitated with the defeat to British prestige to be interested. From where she sat, she could see the renegade, Mr. Fielding. She had had a better view of him from the platform and knew that an Indian child perched on his knee. He was watching the proceedings, watching her. When their eyes met, he turned his away as if direct intercourse was of no interest to him. The magistrate was also happier. He had won the battle of the platform and gained confidence. Intelligent and impartial, he continued to listen to the evidence and tried to forget that later on he should have to pronounce a verdict in accordance with it. The superintendent trundled steadily forward. He had expected these outbursts of insolence. They are the natural gestures of an inferior race, and he betrayed no hatred of Aziz, merely an abysmal contempt. The speech dealt at length with the prisoners' dupes, as they were called, Fielding, the servant Anthony, and the Nawab Bahadur. This aspect of the case had always seemed dubious to Miss Quested, and she had asked the police not to develop it, but they were playing for a heavy sentence and wanted to prove that the assault was premeditated. And, in order to illustrate the strategy, they produced a plan of the Marabar Hills showing the route that the party had taken and the tank and dagger where they had camped. The magistrate displayed interest in archaeology. An elevation of a specimen cave was produced. It was lettered Buddhist Cave. Not Buddhist, I think, Jain. In which cave is the offence alleged, the Buddhist or the Jain? Asked Mahmud Ali with the air of unmasking a conspiracy. All the Marabar caves are Jain. Yes, sir. Then in which Jain cave? You will have an opportunity of putting such questions later. Mr. McBride smiled faintly at their fatuity. Indians invariably collapse over some such point as this. He knew that the defense had some wild hope of establishing an alibi, that they had tried unsuccessfully to identify the guide, and that Fielding and Hamidullah had gone out to the Kawa Dol and paced and measured all one moonlit night. Mr. Leslie says they're Buddhist, and he ought to know if anyone does. But may I call attention to the shape? And he described what had occurred there. Then he spoke of Miss Derrick's arrival, of the scramble down the gully, of the return of the two ladies to Chandrapur, and of the document Miss Quested signed on her arrival, in which mention was made of the field glasses. And then came the culminating evidence, the discovery of the field glasses on the prisoner. I have nothing to add at present, he concluded, removing his spectacles. I will now call my witnesses. The facts will speak for themselves. The prisoner is one of those individuals who have led a double life. I dare say his degeneracy gained upon him gradually. He has been very cunning at concealing, as is usual with the type, and pretending to be a respectable member of society, getting a government position even. He is now entirely vicious and beyond redemption, I'm afraid. He behaved most cruelly, most brutally, to another of his guests, another English lady. In order to get rid of her and leave him free for his crime, he crushed her into a cave among his servants. However, that is by the way. But his last words brought on another storm, and suddenly a new name, Mrs. Moore, burst on the court like a whirlwind. Mahmud Ali had been enraged. His nerves snapped. He shrieked like a maniac and asked whether his client was charged with murder as well as rape, and who was this second English lady. I don't propose to call her. You don't because you can't. You have smuggled her out of the country. Where is Mrs. Moore? She would have proved his innocence. She was on our side. She was poor Indian's friend. You could have called her yourself, cried the magistrate. Neither side called her, neither must quote her as evidence. She was kept from us until too late. I learned too late. This is English justice. Here is your British Raj. Give us back Mrs. Moore for 5 minutes only, and she will save my friend. She will save the name of his sons. Don't rule her out, Mr. Das. Take back those words, as you yourself are a father. Tell me where they have put her. Oh, Mrs. Moore! If the point is of any interest, my mother should have reached Arden, said Ronnie dryly. He ought not to have intervened, but the onslaught had startled him. Imprisoned by you there because she knew the truth. He was almost out of his mind and could be heard saying above the tumult, I ruined my career no matter. We are all to be ruined one by one. This is no way to defend your case, counselled the magistrate. I am not defending a case, nor are you trying one. We are both of us slaves. Mr. Mahmud Ali, I have already warned you, and unless you sit down, I shall exercise my authority. Do so. This trial is a farce. I am going. And he handed his papers to Amritrao and left, calling from the door histrionically, yet with intense passion, Aziz! Aziz! Farewell! Forever! The tumult increased. The invocation of Mrs. Moore continued, and people who did not know what the syllables meant repeated them like a charm. They became Indianized into S. Miss Moore. S. Miss S. Moore. They were taken up in the street outside. In vain the magistrate threatened and expelled until the magic exhausted itself. He was powerless. Unexpected, remarked Mr. Turton. Ronnie furnished the explanation. Before she sailed, his mother had taken to talk about the Marabar in her sleep, especially in the afternoon when servants were on the veranda, and her disjointed remarks on Aziz had doubtless been sold to Mahmud Ali for a few annas. That kind of thing never ceases in the East. I thought they'd try something of the sort. Ingenious. He looked into their wide-open mouths. They get just like that over their religion, he added calmly. Start and can't stop. I'm sorry for your old Das. He's not getting much of a show.
Mr. Heslop, how disgraceful dragging in your dear mother, said Miss Derrick, bending forward.
It's just a trick, and they happen to pull it off. Now one sees why they had Mahmud Ali, just to make a scene on the chance. It is his speciality. But he disliked it more than he showed. It was revolting to hear his mother, travestied into Miss S. Moore, a Hindu goddess. Miss S. Moore, Miss S. Moore, Miss S. Moore, Miss S. Moore.
Ronnie?
Yes, old girl.
Isn't it all queer?
I'm afraid it's very upsetting for you.
Not the least, I don't mind.
Well, that's good. She had spoken more naturally and healthily than usual. Bending into the middle of her friends, she said,
"Don't worry about me. I'm much better than I was. I don't feel the least faint. I shall be all right, and thank you all, thank you for your kindness."
She had to shout her gratitude, for the chant, "Es miss es more," went on. Suddenly it stopped. It was as if the prayer had been heard and the relics exhibited. "I apologize for my colleague," said Mr. Amritrao, rather to everyone's surprise. "He is an intimate friend of our client, and his feelings have carried him away." "Mr. Mahmud Ali will have to apologize in person," the magistrate said. "Exactly, sir, he must. But we had just learnt that Mrs. Moore had important evidence which she desired to give. She was hurried out of the country by her son before she could give it, and this unhinged Mr. Mahmud Ali, coming as it does upon an attempt to intimidate our only other European witness, Mr. Fielding. Mr. Mahmud Ali would have said nothing had not Mrs. Moore been claimed as a witness by the police." He sat down. "An extraneous element is being introduced into the case," said the magistrate. "I must repeat that as a witness, Mrs. Moore does not exist. Neither you, Mr. Amritrao, nor Mr. McBride, you, have any right to surmise what that lady would have said. She is not here, and consequently she can say nothing." "Well, I withdraw my reference," said the superintendent wearily. "I would have done so 15 minutes ago if I'd been given the chance. She is not of the least importance to me." "I have already withdrawn it for the defense," he added with forensic humor. "Perhaps you can persuade the gentleman outside to withdraw it too." For the refrain of the street continued. "I am afraid my powers do not extend so far," said Das, smiling. So peace was restored, and when Adela came to give her evidence, the atmosphere was quieter than it had been since the beginning of the trial. Experts were not surprised. There is no stay in your native. He blazes up over a minor point and has nothing left for the crisis. What he seeks is a grievance, and this he had found in the supposed abduction of an old lady. He would now be less aggrieved when Aziz was deported. But the crisis was still to come. Adela had always meant to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, and she had rehearsed this as a difficult task. Difficult because her disaster in the cave was connected, though by a thread, with another part of her life, her engagement to Ronnie. She had thought of love just before she went in, and had innocently asked Aziz what marriage was like, and she supposed that her question had roused evil in him. To recount this would have been incredibly painful. It was the one point she wanted to keep obscure. She was willing to give details that would have distressed other girls, but this story of her private failure she dared not allude to, and she dreaded being examined in public in case something came out. But as soon as she rose to reply and heard the sound of her own voice, she feared not even that. A new and unknown sensation protected her, like magnificent armor. She didn't think what had happened or even remember in the ordinary way of memory, but she returned to the Marabar Hills and spoke from them across a sort of darkness to Mr. McBride. The fatal day recurred in every detail, but now she was of it and not of it at the same time, and this double relation gave it indescribable splendor. Why had she thought the expedition dull. Now the sun rose again. The elephant waited. The pale masses of the rock flowed round her and presented the first cave. She entered, and a match was reflected in the polished walls, all beautiful and significant, though she had been blind to it at the time. Questions were asked, and to each she found the exact reply. Yes, she had noticed the tank of the dagger, but not known its name. Yes, Mrs. Moore had been tired after the first cave and sat in the shadow of a great rock near the dried-up mud. Smoothly the voice in the distance proceeded, leading along the paths of truth, and the airs from the punkah behind her wafted her on. The prisoner and the guide took you on to the Kawa Dol, no one else being present.
The most wonderfully shaped of those hills, yes.
As she spoke, she created the Kawa Dol, saw the niches up the curve of the stone, and felt the heat strike her face. And something caused her to add,
No one else was present, to my knowledge. We appeared to be alone.
Very well. There is a ledge halfway up the hill, or broken ground rather, with caves scattered near the beginning of a nullah.
I know where you mean.
You went alone into one of those caves?
That is quite correct.
And the prisoner followed you? Now we've got him, from the major. She was silent. The court, the place of question, awaited her reply, but she could not give it until Aziz entered the place of answer. The prisoner followed you, didn't he? He repeated in the monotonous tones that they both used. They were employing agreed words throughout, so that this part of the proceedings held no surprises.
May I have half a minute before I reply to that, Mr. McBride?
Certainly. Her vision was of several caves. She saw herself in one, and she was also outside it, watching its entrance, for Aziz to pass in. She failed to locate him. It was the doubt that had often visited her, but solid and attractive, like the hills.
I am not.
Speech was more difficult than vision.
I am not quite sure.
I beg your pardon, said the superintendent of police.
I cannot be sure.
I didn't catch that answer. He looked scared, his mouth shut with a snap. You are on that landing, or whatever we term it, and you have entered a cave. I suggest to you that the prisoner followed you. She shook her head. What do you mean, please?
No,
she said, in a flat, unattractive voice. Slight noises began in various parts of the room, but no one yet understood what was occurring except Fielding. He saw that she was going to have a nervous breakdown, and that his friend was saved. What is that? What are you saying? Speak up, please. The magistrate bent forward.
I'm afraid I've made a mistake.
What nature of mistake?
Dr. Aziz never followed me into the cave.
The superintendent slammed down his papers, then picked them up and said calmly, Now, Miss Quested, let us go on. I will read you the words of the deposition which you signed 2 hours later in my bungalow. Excuse me, Mr. McBride, you cannot go on. I am speaking to the witness myself, and the public will be silent. If it continues to talk, I'll have the court cleared. Miss Quested, address your remarks to me, who am the magistrate in charge of the case, and realize their extreme gravity. Remember, you speak on oath, Miss Quested.
Dr. Aziz, never.
I stop these proceedings on medical grounds, cried the Major on a word from Turton, and all the English rose from their chairs at once, large white figures behind which the little magistrate was hidden. The Indians rose too. Hundreds of things went on at once, so that afterwards each person gave a different account of the catastrophe. You withdraw the charge? Answer me! Shrieked the representative of justice. Something that she did not understand took hold of the girl and pulled her through. Though the vision was over and she had returned to the insipidity of the world, she remembered what she had learned. Atonement and confession, they could wait. It was in hard, prosaic tones that she said, I withdraw everything. Enough. Sit down. Mr. McBride, do you wish to continue in the face of this? The superintendent gazed at his witness as if she was a broken machine and said, Are you mad? Don't question her, sir. You have no longer the right. Give me time to consider. Sahib, you will have to withdraw. This becomes a scandal, boomed the Nawab Bahadur suddenly from the back of the court. He shall not, shouted Mrs. Turton against the gathering tumult. Call the other witnesses. We're none of us safe. Ronnie tried to check her, and she gave him an irritable blow, then screamed insults at Adela. The superintendent moved to the support of his friends, saying nonchalantly to the magistrate as he did so, Right, I withdraw. Mr. Das rose, nearly dead with the strain. He had controlled the case, just controlled it. He had shown that an Indian can preside. To those who could hear him, he said, The prisoner is released without one stain on his character. The question of costs will be decided elsewhere. And then the flimsy framework of the court broke up. The shouts of derision and rage culminated. People screamed and cursed, kissed one another, wept passionately. Here were the English whom their servants protected, where Aziz fainted in Hamidullah's arms. Victory on this side, defeat on that. Complete for one moment was the antithesis. Then life returned to its complexities. Person after person struggled out of the room to their various purposes, and before long no one remained on the scene of the fantasy but the beautiful, naked god. Unaware that anything unusual had occurred, he continued to pull the cord of his punkah, to gaze at the empty dais and the overturned special chairs, and rhythmically to agitate the clouds of descending dust. Thank you all for joining me. More tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. Until I see you all again, everyone, please stay very well.